안녕하세요. 방금 소개받은 맹정이라고 합니다. 반갑습니다. 이렇게 작가님을 직접 한국에서 만나서 작업을 볼 수 있어서 너무 저는 개인적으로 영광이고, 사실 이 30여 년의 작업 세계를 정말 1시간도 안 되는 시간 안에 다 소개를 하고 얘기를 나누기가 너무 정말 압축된 시간이기 때문에 조금 저도 부담이 되게 많이 되는 것 같아요. 제대로 소개를 해드릴 수 있을까 하는 생각이 좀 들긴 하는데, 그래도 이제 작가 얘기를 나누면서 조금이라도 이제 작업 세계에 대해서 알아볼 수 있는 시간을 가졌으면 좋겠습니다. 그 핸드아웃이나 갤러리 그 소개에서 자세히 이제 보시면은 아시겠지만 그간 리서치나 심도 깊은 리서치나 개인적이지만 굉장히 밀도 있는 그 과정을 통해서 조각이나 평면, 또 구조, 또 설치나 대형 공공미술 프로젝트 등으로 여러 경유를 경유해서 그 풍경이라는 주제에 대해서 접근해 왔는데요. 사실 풍경이라고 하면은 우리는 굉장히 일상적으로 많이 사용하는 단어이기도 하고 또 굉장히 또 넓은 광범위한 의미를 가지고 있기도 해서 일단 그 테레시타가 얘기하는 풍경에 진입하기에 앞서서 여기 오신 분들에게 우리에게는 이제 풍경이 어떤 의미로 우리가 쓰이고 어떻게 우리가 이용을 하고 또 어떤 시각으로 보고 있는지를 조금 먼저 한번 생각해보고 이렇게 얘기를 나누면 좋을 것 같아요. 저도 아시아인으로서 또 한국에서 이 한국이라는 지역적 특성 이 안에서 사는 사람으로서 풍경이 과연 무엇일지에 대해서 다시 한번 또 생각해보는 계기가 되었고, 저는 항상 어떻게 보면 풍경의 일부로서 그 풍경을 바라보고 있다는 생각, 이게 분리되지 않고 그 안에서 나를 위치시켰던 것 같아요. 어떻게 보면 굉장히 소극적인 관점으로 보일 수 있는 것 같지만 그런 자연이나 풍경을 대하는 태도가 또 약간 서구의 시각과 조금 다르긴 한데 이 작가님의 작업은 그런 부분이 사실은 되게 혼재되어 있다는 생각을 많이 했었어요. 작업을 보면서 이게 서구적인 관점도 아니면서도 또 이 동양적인 우리가 생각하는 그 풍경의 관점을 같이 이렇게 혼재시키는 약간 그런 느낌을 받아서 테레시타가 생각하는 그런 풍경의 의미에 대해서 조금 저희도 이제 저희가 생각하는 풍경의 의미를 생각해 보면서 얘기를 들어보면 좋을 것 같습니다. 그걸 시작으로 해보면 좋을 것 같아요.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So I think, in a way, it's good to start with a very broad question because this is a very, very big question, and there's a difference between the idea of landscape and the word landscape, right? So we can start there, perhaps, because we live in a very kind of language-driven culture where we sometimes think that the name of something is the same thing as the thing we're referring to. Yeah, and it's an interesting analogy because sort of language is also a living thing, right? So perhaps we can maybe not think so much about the word landscape, like not preoccupy ourselves with the word so much, and rather think a little bit by replacing it with other words like place or orientation or wayfinding, or how it is that we figure out aspects of ourselves by understanding the world around us. Yeah, and so I guess the way that I can kind of answer it as an introductory question that most reflects my practice for, several decades is that when I think about a place, I'm not just thinking about the sort of physical characteristics of a place or how it looks, but rather how it is that it lives in our imagination. And what aspect of the thing that you call landscape that's usually in front of your eyes, right? But that is also sort of underground and behind your head and far away in the cosmos and at the bottom of the ocean. Like these things are also landscape. But how it is that we can kind of qualify landscape by orienting ourselves and by asking ourselves, when we look at of what we think of as a landscape, what can't we see? And for me, that's usually where all of the sort of historical and economic and racial and social and geological information is that tells many, many different stories that you can't kind of perceive right away.
그래서 그 테레시다 얘기했던 그 풍경은 보지 못하는 것, 보이지 않는 것에 대한 것이다라는 그 말에 너무 공감을 했고요. 그 landscape is about what you don't see. 거기에 정말 공감했는데 결국 그 소유할 수 없는 개념이 될 수밖에 없는 우리 풍경은 그래서 되게 굉장히 개념적일 수밖에 없고 또 본질에 가까워진다고 생각할수록 또 멀어질 수밖에 없는 그런 모순을 안고 있는 것 같아요. 그래서 그동안 해왔던 그 글들이나 작업들을 보면서 굉장히 촘촘하고 단단하게 그런 주제에 대한 개념을 다져온 것이 이제 느껴져서 사실은 저도 이제 그 과정을 지켜보면서 굉장히 이제 충만해지는 느낌을 받았습니다. 그래서 당신 작업에서 역시 이제 개념적이지만 물성이 가진 성질에 대한 연구와 또 작업의 그 친밀함, 그 인티머시를 놓치지 않으려는 노력이 약간 그런 본질에 가까이 다가가려고 하는 노력인 것 같은데 그 인티머시에 대해서 조금 얘기를 해주시면 좋을 것 같아요.
Thank you. That's a great question. So I think the sort of response that I appreciate the most in viewers is a sense of intimacy, and so that's part of the goal in a way. If I can achieve that sense of intimacy, to me that is already very much connected to the idea of landscape. Yeah, in part because intimacy suggests an interiority as opposed to an exteriority, which is the mode that we are accustomed to place the idea of landscape. And if I could just elaborate, so for me, the way that functions on a more practical level, I don't want to speak just about very sort of conceptual things, but in the actual making of the artwork, for me, that the process also has a kind of intimacy in my dialogue with specific materials and with the materiality. And I like the idea of landscape. I don't really think of materials as being neutral either. Materials are literally like parts of places, so they are already landscapes in and of themselves. And so at the bottom here you have charcoal, which is basically a tree that has been burned. And so it is already this very earthen, real place, right? And then above that you have these layers of sand, which also comes from a place. And so the image is not a painting and it's not a picture of a landscape. It is through the materiality, both conceptually and as a fact, it is already a place. It's a place. It's a place made of lots of places within the artwork, and so it's very ephemeral and it's very interior because really we can't quite pinpoint where the landscape stops and the material starts, and where the landscape and the material stop and your own body starts, right? And your own body being a carbon-based entity made of the same exact materials as what we think of as landscape.
이어서 그러면 어떻게 그 거리 조절, 그 내가 자연의 일부이면서도 그 자연의 연장이기도 한 그 관계를 어떻게 작업을 하는 과정에서 어떻게 본인을 위치시킬 수 있는지, 그게 굉장히 모순된, 아까 일전도 얘기했던 약간 그런 모순된 상황이 계속 놓이게 되잖아요. 그걸 어떻게 그 밸런스를 유지하는지가 갑자기 궁금해져서 여쭤봅니다.
Another great question, because basically when something is very far away, but also when something is very, very close, we can't see. We cannot see very, very close things or very, very far things. And so there's a particular way that humans see that captures what we think of as the way that we see, right? That how we qualify things. But it leads me to, like, the way I want to answer that actually has to do with scale more than distance. And I think scale is a kind of measurement of distance. And so, for example, this piece on the wall here, which is made out of ceramics, I'm very interested in this connection between the intimate and the small and the immense and the very big, right? And so on the one hand, we have these very sort of intimate, tiny, tiny microscopic things, and then we have galaxies and the cosmos, and the ways in which these patterns and images and systems look almost exactly identical. And so if you look at this piece, you understand it one way from this distance, right, as this kind of multitude of points that create one kind of floating image, hovering image. And then as you get close, each one of those tiny cubes becomes almost like its own topography, almost like its own place. And especially in all of them, but especially in the blue ones, if you get close, you can see that the image, the closer that you get, the bigger the image gets, right? So it feels like you're zooming in, but the image is very, very, very huge. It looks like a galaxy or something quite vast. And so I'm always playing with these two simultaneous scales that have to do with small, very, very small and very immense, but also with this kind of shifting vantage point that has to do with how something changes before your very eyes as you get closer or farther away from it, which is, exactly how it is that we see the thing that we also call landscape in the world.
이게 지금 말씀으로 하시기는 되게 간단하게 얘기를 언어로는 그렇게 될 수 있는데 정말 그 두 거리 조절을 하는 것이 작업으로 그렇게 조절하면서 할 수 있는 게 정말 어려운 일이거든요. 작업을 하는 작가들분 아시겠지만, 그래서 그거에서 저는 정말 너무 그 스케일의 그 차이를 그 오가는 그런 규모가 너무 대단하다는 생각을 한다고 말씀을 드리고 싶고, 그리고 조금 지금 현재 전시되고 있는 작업에 대한 조금 인티메트한 질문을 좀 하고 싶어서 그 다음으로 이제 넘어가도록 할게요. 그동안 사용했던 재료들이 이제 반사되는 작업들이 있었고, 또 큰 대형 그 설치 작업, 외부에 이제 공공미술로 설치된 작업에서는 그 외부의 풍경이랑 자기 자신의 모습이 이제 자기 작품에 이제 반사되면서 또 다른 풍경을 또 만들어내는 작업들이 굉장히 많았는데요. 이번에 이제 여기서 전시되는 작품들을 이제 보면서 좀 저는 사실 그 전에 이제 작업하실 때는 그 작업 스케일이나 아니면 반사되는 작품에 내가 들어가 있고 보는 거에서 오히려 저를 보지만 제가 실제 거기 없는 듯한 느낌을 받을 때도 있었던 것 같아요. 그래서 그냥 설치와 제가 그 작업과 함께 그 공간에 있다는 정도의 그 존재를 이제 인식하는 그런 정도의 감상이었다면, 이번에 전시된 작품들을 보면서 저는 굉장히 좀 감명을 받았던 부분은 이제 그런 그 시선을 튕겨낸다 그러나 이렇게 그런 게 아니고 받아들이면서도 그 밸런스가 조금 달라졌다는 느낌을 좀 받았거든요. 그래서 그런 부분에서 이게 의도된 건 아니겠지만 어떻게 작업에 이제 이번 전시에서 보여지게 됐는지 그게 조금 궁금해졌습니다.
Yes, no, I mean, everything is intentional. So it is very intentional. There is a kind of opacity to these pieces. And in many past works, I will first say the use of reflective surfaces in past works is also very intentional. And it has to do, it connects a lot to some of the social political content in the work, and this idea of, a lot of times my work is about colonial histories and sort of like lots of sort of political references that live within this kind of abstraction or within this idea of a place. And the reflective surface was often a way of sort of prompting and sometimes challenging viewers to sort of find themselves within not just the artwork, but in the kind of set of reference points that the artwork proposes. Yeah, and so in the works in this particular show, I don't know exactly why, but I mean, I know why now, but when I was making it, I really wanted to make this opaque surface where you were absorbed rather than reflected back. And part of these references to this liquid environment and this oceanic environment, for me, have a lot to do with migration, and the history of human migration has been primarily over water, and both natural and forced, right? And so the reference of the water is like very specific in this very subtle kind of set of points that I'm making for myself when I'm deciding that this is the subject or the image that I want to work with. And so if you think of, I was thinking a lot of how unforgiving this kind of liquid environment can be, and how kind of mysterious, but also, I think unforgiving and sort of, there are all these metaphors in literature of how it is that the ocean holds secrets and history, right? And what we don't see at the bottom of the ocean, that is sort of like the remnants of all of this sort of activity on the surface of the water. And so the pieces in the exhibition are very much about thinking of that submarine environment, right? And it's generally an environment that you also can't see, right? Because it's too far down, it's too deep. And so we often think of the ocean as being this kind of reflective surface, right? But only if we're thinking about the surface, right? And again, it goes back to that way of thinking beyond the surface or the, say, topography of a place, and instead thinking a bit more of the topology of a place, right? And these are two, I don't know how you'll translate these, but these are two, they're slightly different conceptual frameworks, right? If the topography is the surface of something, the topology is like the place of change, right? And if you think of like a Mobius strip, it is usually how topology is explained, right? It's something that has been twisted. There's been something that distorts it or changes it, right? And so applying some of these ideas of beyond the surface and beyond the topography, all of the ways in which these watery environments are precisely these places of great sort of global transitions in relation to human history.
그래서 그 말씀해주신 것처럼 그 의도를 그렇게 드러내지 않으면서 동시에 이제 되게 은유적으로 작업에 표현하는 것을 예전에 어디 인터뷰에서 말씀하신 그 포일이라고 그 단어를 쓰시면서 얘기를 했던 것 같아요. 그래서 그 드러나지 않는 것을 드러내지는 작업을 통해 드러내려는 그런 그 태도 이런 부분 그때 저도 이제 그 자세히 기억은 안 나지만 그 포일이라고 얘기를 하면서 이제 말씀하셨던 부분을 조금 더 얘기를 해주실 수 있는지.
Oh, so I think maybe that's conflating a couple of different things. Yeah. So I'll clarify. So when I say that something is a foil, I think the word landscape is a foil. Right? The word landscape is was a foil in the sense that everybody thinks that they understand what a landscape is, and for the most part, nobody is offended by the word landscape, and it's a very benevolent sounding word. It's it's not an aggressive kind of word, and it's not a controversial word, and so as a foil, as a strategy, it means that I can think about a lot of other things and say a lot of other things that I'm kind of, hiding within this idea that lures you in, that you think you know what it's about. But it's really not about landscape in any traditional way. And then I'll answer the second part of the question. Yeah. And then I'll answer the second part, because that's an interesting point, is that I think that so the subtlety is very, very important to me, and it is something that I think is powerful in in how I approach things, meaning I'm not trying to prove something, and I'm not trying to make a declaration about something, and I'm not making a slogan about what I actually might believe from a social political content, point of view. I'm not trying to declare anything. The work doesn't function that way. It functions within the very powerful mode of subtlety. And it is hard to, it is a very difficult part of the process, right? Because I don't know how to do it when I'm doing it. So I know how to talk about it in a public lecture after it's finished and I know what I'm doing. But when I'm actually doing it, I think of it as a kind of wayfinding, right? I think of it as almost trying to like move through a place, like when you arrive someplace and you don't know which way you're going. And so there's a kind of path that I have to make for myself that is also equally subtle and that requires a lot of self-reflection and that requires a lot of dialogue with the materials. And it is not like I don't know how to do that before I've done that. Like with this body of work, I did things that I had never done before. And it's almost always like that, where I don't know the path until I'm actually taking the path. And any kind of sense, like that quality that we are calling intimacy, that is where I know that the work is finished, and it's just the right tone. That happens only but like I cannot transfer that quality to you as viewers unless I myself have felt that and experienced it. That's how I know when to stop, is when the artwork does that for me, right? But I don't have a formulaic sort of approach, even though I do a lot of research about things that are researchable. Some of the research is actually just a more reflective kind of patience, maybe, a kind of patience that I think produces a work that might look effortless or very ephemeral. And there's no way to speed it up or fake it.
그 말에 정말 저도 공감을 하고요. 그래서 결국 어떻게 보면은 그 풍경이라는 큰 주제를 통해서 결국 트레시타 작업은 보는 것에 대한 얘기를 하고 있는 게 아닌가 하는 생각을 하게 됐어요. 그리고 이 풍경이란 단어 자체는 사실 변하지 않고 여전히 우리가 쓰고 동일하게 있지만 그거를 둘러싼 뭐 재료를 사용하는 데 있어서나 또 재료 선택이나 또 작업의 모양이나 이런 거는 끊임없이 그 작가님이 실험하고 하는 것에 따라서 이제 변화하고 있는 것 같아요. 그래서 이번에 이제 이 작업 이후에도 또 이런 계속 변화하는 이런 성질의 이 풍경들을 통해서 또 그냥 살짝 듣기로는 이제 영상 작업도 이제 하신다고 들었는데 그거에 대해서도 말씀해 주시면은 아마 시간이 거의 맞을 것 같습니다.
So I don't really do video, but I have made films. Yes. Oh, yeah, film. Yes, film. Yeah. So I'm doing my second film now. The first film that I did is titled Guahani, and both films I shot in Cuba, which is where my family is from, and they're shot on 16 millimeter black and white, so not video. Very, very kind of old style film, they are very much both about aspects of landscape. Each one, well, I'll talk about the first one because the second one is a little bit of not something I'm talking about yet. It's not quite finished, but the first one was shot in the Viñales Valley, which is a rural part of Cuba that is a very beautiful place. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's a very surreal-looking place with these kind of very odd-shaped mountains, and it's very green, very bright green. The film is about sort of playing a little bit with this idea of this kind of art history trope of the figure in the landscape. And so there's a family that lives there that I know and that my family knows. and they have been cultivating this land for many generations. And the film is really an inversion of the idea of figure in the landscape. So it's a film about the landscape looking at the family instead of the family looking at the landscape. And in this capacity, it sort of moves through these diurnal and nocturnal changes and things that are happening in the place, you know, the small animals, a flower opening up. There are also many caves in this area. And so it's a very lush film about this sort of exchange and this sort of reciprocity of the landscape not being like an object, but rather being almost like a living entity that's looking at the people instead of the people looking at the landscape.
It's a very basic one because we talk about scale. And looking around, I can see you go from very big formats, like the one that you have here, to a very tiny one that it's over there. And I was wondering, which is the format you feel more comfortable with? And I was also wondering whether the dynamic between you and the work while you're making it changes depending on the different scale.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your question. I kind of think of all the pieces in this show as small, really. So I tend to work very, very large scale. And my tendency is I feel more comfortable working large scale, in part because there's something so like kind of grandiose about thinking about landscape. But I also really like working very small scale. I think the medium scale, I sometimes I'm not so interested in it, but there's a way in which a very, very small work, like the small piece that's on the wall here, the little piece there, or each little cube here, can actually contain the biggest image. So that is something, I'm interested in sort of like really big things and really small things. But I kind of think of everything in this show as small also, compared to what I usually do. So yes, and I think, does my relationship to it change? Yeah, I think it depends on the material too, right? So there are some materials that are very hard to change, and I'm not really painting anything, right? I'm a sculptor, so all of these pieces I think of as sculptures, not paintings, and so they have a physicality to them. And I would say more than scale, I would say what is the level of resistance that a material is giving me in order to be able to change it.
작가님이랑 댓글로 통화해 주신 김현정 선생님께 감사의 박수 부탁드리겠습니다.